Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening for the fourth of a four-part series on dyslexia. This four-part Georgia Department of Education Dyslexia Video Series was developed through a partnership between the Georgia Department of Education and the Mary Frances Early College of Education at the University of Georgia. Tonight's topic is structured literacy and dyslexia, and is the final video in the series. This video explains what's meant by a structured literacy approach to reading instruction and what this means for students with dyslexia. Just as a reminder, we have received questions from some of you, but if you have others during the webinar tonight, please place your questions in the chat at any time. Drs. Lindstrom and Sayeski will answer them at the end of the webinar during the Q&A portion. And our question moderator, Nicole Vella, the president of the Reading League Georgia, will be monitoring those questions for us. Before we begin, I have the privilege of introducing our speakers this evening, Dr. Kristen Sayeski and Dr. Jennifer Lindstrom. Dr. Sayeski is an associate professor in the Department of Communication Sciences and Special Education and co-director of the Dyslexia Certificate Endorsement Programs at the University of Georgia. Dr. Sayeski received her doctorate in special education from the University of Virginia in 2000. Her professional and research interests include identifying exemplary practices related to teacher development and determining effective instructional practices for students with learning disabilities, particularly in reading instruction and intervention. Dr. Jennifer Lindstrom joined the teaching and learning team at the Georgia Department of Education in September of 2021 as the statewide dyslexia coordinator to assist our state as we lift awareness of dyslexia and create stronger evidence-based supports for students who are experiencing difficulties while learning to read and write. Dr. Lindstrom's leadership and guidance will ensure that our students get the best of the best from our teachers and schools. Dr. Lindstrom continues to serve as associate professor in the Department of Communication Sciences and Special Education and as adjunct professor in the Department of Educational Psychology at the University of Georgia. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sayeski and Lindstrom. Take it away, Kristen.
Yes. Okay, and thank you, Kim, for that wonderful welcome, and welcome to all who are here this evening, and welcome to those who are joining us by watching the recording, wherever you might be. So as Kim just mentioned, this is our fourth and final webinar in this series. If you have not had a chance to watch the webinars 1 through 3, the recording, we'll drop the link to the recordings in the chat. But we are excited to bring you this final episode in the series. It's a little bit longer this evening than the others because the video is twice as long as the other videos, and we just have a lot of wonderful information to share with you all. So as Kim said, please ask questions. We'll try to get to them throughout. I think we'll be answering a lot of the questions that have already come in. And if we don't get to them during the presentation, we'll have time at the end for more Q&A. So at this time, I will turn it over to Dr. Sayeski.
Thank you, Jennifer. As Jennifer said, this video really gets into the content, the meat of what should be occurring and what we know from research is particularly effective to happen during reading instruction. Because it is a little bit longer video and there's a little more content, we're going to dive right in with the first segment and get started.
Welcome to the fourth video in our dyslexia series, Structured Literacy and Dyslexia. This video series was developed through a partnership between the Georgia Department of Education and the Mary Frances Early College of Education at the University of Georgia. In this video, we will explore what is meant by a structured literacy approach to reading instruction and what this means for students with dyslexia. As we have reviewed in prior videos, students with dyslexia experience difficulty with word-level reading. These students have difficulty attending to the small units or parts of words. But what does instruction in small units look like? Effective instruction can look different across different decoding programs or approaches, but they will share certain elements. Specifically, effective instruction will be structured in such a way as to scaffold student learning. teachers will move from teaching simple to more complex skills over the course of instruction. Structured literacy is an umbrella term that refers to approaches to reading that reflect key instructional features, as well as content elements that have been associated with gains in reading development. Instructional features refer to how a teacher is presenting information, while content elements refer to what a teacher is teaching. We will start by examining the elements of how a teacher presents information. 3 core principles guide the delivery of structured literacy approaches. The delivery of structured literacy is explicit, systematic, and cumulative. The principle of explicit instruction guides how information is introduced and how errors are addressed. One way to conceptualize explicit instruction is to think about a sports coach. The coach explains and demonstrates a skill, such as teaching proper foot placement for kicking a ball. Then, the coach guides the athlete in practicing this skill while giving specific feedback. Finally, the athlete will apply that skill in a more complex environment like a scrimmage. Explicit instruction in reading works the same way as it does on the soccer field. Within explicit instruction, a teacher directly teaches the sub-skills associated with reading. For example, a teacher would begin by teaching the letter sounds for S, T, P, O, and A. The teacher would then teach students how to blend those sounds together to read words. S, A, T, sat. In addition, teachers will directly show students how changing a letter changes the word. Sat becomes sap, sap becomes tap, and so forth. Finally, a student would practice applying this skill while reading a book that features these phonics patterns. In contrast, there are approaches to reading that are not explicit. Some approaches to reading are based upon the assumption that through repeated exposure to words, students will either memorize whole words by sight or intuitively pick up on word patterns. 2 types of books reflect an implicit approach to reading development: predictable and leveled books. Many of us fondly remember Brown Bear, What Do You See? And the delightful experience when a new animal would appear. This is an example of a predictable book. With predictable text, readers predict the next word that will appear, in some cases without even seeing the word. Knowing a word without even looking at the printed word is not reading. For preschool children, predictable books are great for oral language development and can help young children learn concepts of print, such as the fact that print conveys a message that is decoded by the skilled reader, and directionality as the reader moves from front to back and left to right when reading. These books do not, though, build word-level reading skills, as they do not direct students' attention to the alphabetic principle. School-age students may also experience instruction that is not explicit. In these classrooms, students are assigned leveled books. Parents and many teachers may assume that a book at a student's just right level will include words that the student can read, but this is not how leveled books work. Leveled books are determined by things like the number of sentences in a book, length of sentences, and the number of syllables. Therefore, lower leveled books will be shorter and have fewer sentences. But what is not controlled for with leveled books are the phonics patterns included. Here is an example of a first grade leveled book. Coyotes are wild dogs. Coyotes are mammals. Coyotes have a pointy face and pointy ears. Coyotes are mammals. Coyotes howl loudly. Coyotes are mammals. Are the sentences short? Yes. Is the book brief? Yes. Does the passage contain only 1 to 3 syllable words? Yes. But a first grader attempting to read this book will run into quite a few phonics patterns, including ild, oi, long A written with magic E, R controlled ear, owl spelled 2 different ways, OW and OU. Further, the repetition of the sentence, coyotes are mammals, will likely be memorized by a student after a couple of pages. Unfortunately, research has shown that this type of memorization will not lead to word recognition in other contexts. Ironically, the phonics instruction accompanying this story directed students to identify pictures that begin with the letter C and write a capital and lowercase c under the pictures. The gap between this preschool or early kindergarten phonics skill and the reading demands of the passage is evident.
All right, so there's a lot in that. And the first thing to unravel is that when we talk about a structured literacy approach to reading instruction, to literacy instruction, to be inclusive of writing, we're really talking about how a teacher presents information in his teaching, but then also what a teacher is doing. And in this first section, we get to one part of how a teacher is teaching, and that is that instruction is explicit. When we talk about building students' understanding of anything or building our own personal understanding of something, it's very easy to kind of go, one way to build conceptual understanding is through examples and non-examples. So we can see that not everything a teacher would do would be explicit. There are some non-explicit ways that teachers are going on. And when instruction is not explicit, students are kind of trying to guess or figure out what's going on here. And some students do figure it out. They do pick up on the code rather sort of naturally or through this implicit method. But as we know, for the majority of students, they require explicit ones. And for those who are kind of picking up on it naturally, they benefit, and it can have some benefits in terms of their spelling or how quickly they can move on to more complex patterns and reading material. So I'm going to start, when we think about sort of what is the foundation of structured literacy, there's this quote, and for those of you, I think I might have mentioned in earlier webinars, Rudolf Flesch's book in 1955, which is Why Johnny Can't Read. So I don't know if any of you have read it, but certainly you probably are familiar with this because there's lots of spoofs on why Johnny can't do a lot of things since then. But this was pretty dramatic when it came out at the time, and when Flesch wrote it, and it's 1955, and it was right in the heart of sight word instructions. So everything was whole word, and he was just flabbergasted that this was how we were attempting to teach reading to students when it's a code, so you should teach the code. And he wrote, imagine this, if we had a brand new language and we were going to try to teach it to people, what would our approach be? And it's pretty basic. And it is, imagine, for instance, you are a Hottentot and want to learn how to read and write in the Hottentot language. The natural method will be this. First, your teacher will make you aware of the individual sounds you make when you talk Hottentot. So we need to know those phonemes, and the phonemes in the English language, b. We need to know and become familiar with those. And we know that those, can be mushed together in words or co-articulated. And so we got to teach students how to unglue those. And then second, he will show you the letter symbols that represent each of those sounds. So I'm going to systematically teach you the code. Third, he will teach you how to write these symbols and combine them into words, and at the same time, how to read them. So this is 1955. So this is not groundbreaking. It's just going to think about, if there's a code, here's how you would systematically go about doing that. And the first component of structured literacy is to be explicit in how we do that. And there are some myths and some strongly held beliefs that, in particularly, this comes from this notion of developmentalism, whereas there's sort of this readiness, and that's this innate readiness that a child has, or an individual has, that they're just suddenly then ready to learn the code, which just isn't true. And we have seen studies after studies of kids. They can learn the code. They can learn a lot of things. We start with kids very young, and we teach them their colors, and we might teach them letter names. And there's lots of things that we're doing with preschool kids. We're certainly not, stunting them developmentally by doing that, but there are some people who are very, very fearful. And I think part of that comes from the fact that they think, when we're teaching kids the code, what we might be asking a kindergartner to do is to do what we've got. I'm totally going blank on his name. The Simpsons, whatever that guy's name is. All right, whatever he's doing right there. Writing on the chalkboard, or we're having them like sit at their desk. So you think about, writing letters over Bart. Thank you. Gosh. What we're having Bart do is write over and over again, and we're feeling like, oh, maybe like they're like grueling in the sweat mines, like we're just like having them write over again. But that's not. It can be very playful. It can be very fun, and it's fun for kids to discover this pattern and to play with language and to play with rhyming and to play with it. So if we begin to think about teaching the code as something that is joyful and fun, I think we can have a little less fear of we might be doing some kind of damage to them. Instead, what we find is when kids unlock the code, it increases their confidence. It opens them up to so many aspects of school, which is then going to enable creativity. It's going to enable their curiosity. It's going to make them feel much more part of this community. And so it is important to be explicit in this is where how these sounds are represented by these letters, and this is how we blend them together. And when we're doing that, we can do that in very explicit ways. So I'm going to show you, and I'm going to tell you. It's not going to be a mystery. I'm not going to say, what do you think that this makes? What do you notice about this? Let's don't waste their time. So let's go ahead and let's say, yes, this sound is represented by this letter. Let's practice our letter formation and draw that. Let's make this sound. Let's blend this sound. And I'm going to show you how to blend these sounds together. So I'm going to show you how to do it. We're going to practice it. When you are making the sound and you're not making it quite right, I'm going to say, look at my lips. And I'm going to tell them what to do with their mouths to help them produce these sounds. And then they're going to get lots of practice doing it. And they're going to get lots of feedback until they get quick and they get automatic and they know these words automatically. When you're in those non-explicit, when you've got those patterned books where students are really kind of guessing, or they're relying on pictures to sort of guess what the word is, or to figure out what the word is, that you're building up those bad habits, or the students are struggling on every single word, and you're really creating a behavioral distance between them and this code and this thing that should be fun with them. I may have mentioned this before, but I think one of the most powerful videos to really get at why teaching the code is so important was this mom. And this was during the pandemic. And so her child, her first grader, was at home and was struggling with reading. And the mom was trying to figure out, like, why is my kid struggling with reading? And then she sat down and she started to read this book, and she realized that what her daughter, what she thought was reading, was really just guessing and looking at pictures. And so again, if you haven't seen the Purple Challenge, there's a part 1 and there's a part 2 of it. And it's this mom figuring out that her daughter wasn't being taught the code. And she took it upon herself to figure out a little phonics by looking on the internet, and pretty successfully taught her child some phonics. And so again, it's actually not too complicated. You need a scope and sequence. And then as long as we're explicit, students can learn and pick up on this code. So I recommend those. And then finally, just a myth that I mentioned in the video, but I want to go back to because it comes up again and again and again, is that leveled text aren't what many parents and even some teachers think that they are. And so you think, oh, grade leveled text means that these are words that a first grader knows. Well, if you looked at that book about coyotes are mammals, coyotes have pointy ears, all of those things, you wouldn't be expecting a first grader to be able to decode or read those words. And so how leveled books come about is it really they're short sentences, they're controlling for sentence length, for the number of syllables. Coyote, I had to even look up as I was typing that, how to spell that. That's a very unusual spelling pattern. And so students can get really frustrated trying to make their way because they're thrown all of these different patterns that they're not familiar with and they don't know. But also it just builds that habit of, I'm going to look everywhere except for inside the word to figure out that word. I'm going to look for the pictures. I'm going to use my, what do I think this is going to be? They live in a cave. I'm going to guess that because I'm using some context to it rather than looking at the word to read it and decode it. Then the other thing that goes kind of hand in hand with, we've got these leveled books, so this, that should be giving them what they need. And then we do teach phonics, and you'll hear this very often, particularly when people are talking about balanced literacy approaches, is that we can have both. So we can have kind of this cued guessing, and we can And we can have a little phonics too, and it works just fine. But what happens is there's a huge disconnect. And this is where you get what's considered the bad phonics. And this is your worksheet phonics. And this is your phonics that's not connected to then what they're having to read in terms of connected text. And I mean, I was so shocked when I was like, well, let me see what the phonics lesson is that goes with this coyote lesson. And I saw that this was the worksheet, and I was just stunned, because clearly this is a preschool skill, and you're expecting a kid who could read coyotes are mammals is now, checking off the picture or color in the picture that begins with the letter C. So again, that isn't phonics, and that's not what's meant in structured literacy with phonics. So let's get to the next phase, the next component of how, which is going to be systematic.
This brings us to the next feature of a structured literacy approach. Instruction is systematic. With systematic instruction, skills are sequenced logically. For example, as students build confidence and fluency with basic phonics concepts, more complex phonics patterns are introduced, such as consonant and vowel digraphs, 2 letters that make one sound, and spelling patterns like magic E. Returning to our soccer analogy, after the teacher has taught the phonics pattern and provided direct practice applying the skill to the reading of words in isolation, students will engage with the scrimmage, which is reading connected text. Of course, as it is on the soccer field, feedback and reteaching can and does occur during passage reading. In contrast, within guided reading, an approach to reading that makes use of leveled books, a teacher may preview the book with students and introduce a new word such as the word coyote, but phonics skills are not directly taught. Instead, as students encounter unknown words, they are taught to use cues to figure out what the word is. A cue may be looking at a picture to guess the word or looking at the first letter to guess the word. As you can see, this cue is not guiding students to examine all of the letters or letter patterns within a word. Which brings us to the final element of the delivery of structured literacy, cumulative instruction. Cumulative instruction means not only that teachers will move from simple to more complex, but that ongoing review of previously learned skills will be integrated within students' practice. Cumulative instruction with ongoing review will look like many different things within a structured literacy approach, such as reading passages that contain newly introduced phonics skills as well as previously taught skills, fluency work involving previously taught skills, and comparisons between new information and known information to strengthen concept development. In summary, a structured approach to reading is explicit, systematic, and cumulative. But what is the content of a structured literacy approach? This brings us to the next.
All right. I'll go fairly quickly through this one because I'd already addressed some of these features in terms of it being systematic and moving from simple to complex, and then also cumulative. One of the things, though, that comes up a lot is what is the role of decodable text within instruction? And the way that I like to think about decodable text is the little colorful animals who thankfully don't have names in this picture. And so on the slide, and those are really big puzzle pieces, right? So when we are first teaching kids the code, we are first teaching them the pieces of this puzzle. We're going to have really big, really simple puzzles, all right? And they're going to get this idea of puzzle. And that's what your decodable text is. Your decodable text is your elementary level puzzle to really get them going into it. As students grow in their literacy skills, fairly quickly, we're going to get them into what would be considered a trade book, or think about your children's literature that you would go and you would get from the Scholastic Book Fair. And that's going to be where you're going to have that mishmash of all different kinds of phonics patterns are going to come in here. But we're going to start with our training wheels. We're going to start with decodable text when they begin to say, hey, this is how the code works. I'm getting pretty good at applying this. Once we build up enough skills, we can then kind of scaffold you in this more complex text, but your decodable text is your students' first puzzle, and they're going to feel success when they're doing that. And so there's a great book by Dan Willingham, and it's called Why Don't Students Like School? And in it, he talks a lot about the brain and how the brain learns. And within there, he talks about how the brain, we're essentially lazy. The first job, the first thing brain's going to do is, have I been here before? I'm just going to go back and rely on my memory, right? Because when you have to figure something else out, that's taxing and draining on your brain. And so what we want to do with students is we want to give them a little bit of challenge, but we don't want it to be so overwhelming that they're shutting down, like, I just don't get this. So we want to give them a little puzzle, which is fun, like your Wordle, but it's not going to be too much like the New York Times crossword puzzle. The next thing that I want to go, I feel like my whole goal here is to dispel some myths about structured literacy and to really place those and in a context. And so some people say, oh, structured literacy is phonics only, and it's drill, 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 and kill, right? So if you think about reading instruction as in the easiest way, I think, for people to grasp this is to think about sports, right? And so if you think about what does a good coach do, and that's what you are doing as a teacher, you are coaching them in learning this new complex skill of reading. So if I were a basketball coach, I know nothing about basketball. I love it when I pick these things that I have zero background knowledge in. But if I was a basketball coach, I'm going to teach you how to dribble, right? And we're going to do that in isolation. When I'm a reading coach, I'm a reading teacher, I'm going to teach you the components of this. I'm going to teach you how first of all, these phonemes, we're going to learn how to separate them and say them and make sure that you're hearing them. And we're going to map those to the letters. There's different spelling patterns that represent them. And so we're going to do that, and we're going to do that in a drill. And I want you to get really quick with that. So I might be doing some flashcards with some letters on them, right? Some letter sound cards. We might be doing some blending of it. We might be using magnets, different colored, not different colored, but colored letter magnets for doing this. But we're going to get this drilled down so it's automatic, and it no longer has to be this cognitive thinking test you're going through. And then we're going to do a couple of different more complex drills, right? So we're going to add some pieces to this puzzle, and that's where we're going to bring in our decodable text. I've got a nice little Bob book there, image, and that's really going to be part of your training program. We also are going to say, what does this whole game look like when it looks awesome, when the professionals are doing it, right? So we're going to look at some highlights of our basketball coach. I would say, here's what really skilled players look like, and we're going to look at that. As a teacher in the classroom, I'm going to be reading. I'm going to be modeling what good prosody, what good fluent reading with expression looks and sounds like. So I'm going to kind of show them what good reading is. And then we're also going to get in there, and we want you to start playing, right? We want you to start practicing on this own. And that's where we're going to start scaffolding some engagement with some of that more complex text and getting them reading connected text. So again, structured literacy is not your phonics drill, or this notion of old phonics worksheets only. It really is part of this comprehensive approach to literacy instruction that's going to include all of these different components. All right. So as what does it mean to be systematic? It means that we've got a scope and sequence. There can be different scope and sequences. Some people ask me, what's the best one? Research really doesn't have an answer to that. And we find some very different scope and sequences can be very effective depending upon how it's being implemented. But we do know is typically you start fairly basic. Most of them are going to start with your basic one-on-one sound to one spelling pattern. Some are going to move a little bit more quickly to sound to multiple spelling patterns. Some are going to move more into your digraphs and start talking about different ways of representing, your long vowel sounds and that kind of thing. But we're going to start simple, and we're going to systematically move into more complex. As students begin to pick up on this, hey, this is a code, they're going to start noticing on their own, and they will start picking up on things, and they will start picking up on patterns, but they need a long enough runway to get up to that. And so we've got to have a solid foundation in the basics before you're going to start seeing some students just take off and they're going to start picking up on it. And some you're going to still need to systematically, our kids with dyslexia, we're going to still need to systematically go through and say, okay, now this sound is represented by this spelling pattern. While we're doing that, we're constantly having them practice that skill, and we're going to do that in this controlled environment of this decodable text.
To understand what should be taught, we will compare the content of a structured approach to reading instruction with instruction commonly seen in classrooms where teachers are not systematically teaching the code. We begin by looking at what happens in a non-code-based classroom. Here, early reading instruction will focus primarily on what is commonly referred to as sight word instruction. Beginning in kindergarten, students will be assigned a list of whole words to memorize. Here is an example of whole words a kindergartner may be assigned. Every week or so, students will be quizzed to see if they successfully memorize the words. Unfortunately, there are many problems with this practice. To understand those problems, we will go back to a concept introduced in the video on reading development, the concept of orthographic mapping. Orthographic mapping is the process by which written units, spoken units, and meaning are bonded together, resulting in the automatic recognition of a word. Remember, adults automatically recognize 30,000 to 60,000 words. They did not acquire this impressive sight word vocabulary by memorizing whole words. Instead, orthographic mapping occurred because of attention to the individual letters and letter patterns in a word, which brings us to the first problem with the practice known as sight word instruction. Students are being taught that reading is the memorization of whole words. This practice reflects a long discredited approach to reading called the look-say method, which was popular in the early 1900s. Research has consistently demonstrated that the most efficient and effective path to automatic word recognition is through orthographic mapping, which requires attention to letters, not whole words. The second problem of sight word instruction comes from the types of words included in the sight word lists. The words reflect phonetically regular and irregular words. In a phonetically regular word like bat, each letter represents its most common sound. B for B, A for A, and T for T. With phonetically regular words, students can apply their letter sound knowledge to sound out words. On the other hand, irregular words do not follow predictable or taught letter sound patterns. Let's return to that kindergarten list of words. We can sort these words into words that can be decoded by understanding basic phonics concepts and those that cannot. Now, let's highlight the words a kindergartner would be able to sound out by applying basic phonics skills. There is no reason why these words should be memorized as whole words. Instead, students should be taught how to decode them. We will return to the phonetically irregular words or words that includes phonics patterns that have not been taught later. For now, the point is that through sight word instruction, teachers are using the look-say method to teach words that can be taught through decoding. This brings us to the final problem of sight word practice. Assigning students lists of words to memorize signals to students that they should know all words by sight. This leads to the bad habit of guessing words. Students learn to avoid the more laborious process of decoding, sounding out words, and use whatever cues are available, such as pictures on the page or the first letter of a word, or they simply say a word that makes sense to guess what the unknown word is. In contrast, within a structured approach to literacy, instruction will begin by teaching a small set of letters and their most common sounds. As we discussed in the section on explicit teaching, students will be taught how to blend sounds to read words. Over time, different phonics patterns will be introduced. There are many advantages to a code-based approach. First and foremost, this process is the most efficient way to facilitate orthographic mapping. And second, by teaching a handful of letter sound correspondences or basic phonics patterns, students can apply this knowledge to decode many novel words. In contrast, memorizing whole words is inefficient and limiting. Students can only memorize 300 to 500 words per year.
All right. So, and I think I mentioned this in earlier webinars as well, is that anytime, the common vernacular use of sight word instruction is this notion of flash whole word flashcards. And so we really want to just dispel and do away with that, because what we know from research is how we build sight word recognition, how students get automatic is actually through decoding. So it's when students map sounds to individual letters and go through that process. That they do that a couple of times. Typically for many students, that's going to then make it an automatic word, a word that they know automatically. It isn't that memorizing that whole pattern that happens with that whole word kind of flashcard instruction. It really is through paying attention to those letters and mapping those sounds to it. And so we want to kind of move away from that. And then the second part is that we want to move away from students' very first exposure to reading is memorizing words. And so sometimes I'll have friends or parents will come to me and they're like, oh, I got these flashcards and I'm using these flashcards with my 3 or my 5-year-old. And say, no, just, work with letters and letter sounds is much better for that student than for them to start thinking, I need to recognize words as whole, and they don't realize there's a code here. So it's better to start teaching the code and introducing and playing with the code first than it is to start with this kind of notion of whole word memorization and flashcards. And then one final piece to that, or one related piece to that, is that when we look at what's happening in the brain as students are reading, what we see is that there are really these two routes to word recognition, right? We can either decode a word, so when we come across a word we don't know, whether we're 7 or we're 70, then we are going to kind of sound it out. We're going to break it. As we're older, we've got knowledge of prefixes and suffixes. We're going to look at root words and we'll start maybe chunk the word as we're doing it. So we're not necessarily doing it letter by letter, but we're going to decode, we're going to sound that word out. Well, that activation goes along right here, what's called the dorsal route, which just kind of goes up and along the back part of this brain, right? But once we've done that, and we've done that a couple of times, and then it becomes a sight word, a word that we know automatically, it's going to move along this bottom route right here, which is called the ventral route. And so we can see in brain imaging that there are differences in how we are processing words when it's a familiar word that we know versus a word that's unfamiliar and we're having to sound it out. And there are these two different routes. And then one is obviously more efficient because we're doing that then automatically. When we do that, it frees up our brain for thinking about comprehending the context in which we just read that word.
A final advantage of a structured, code-based approach to reading is that this decoding instruction is paired with spelling instruction, which enhances both processes. During decoding instruction, teachers begin with the simplest phonics patterns such as consonant-vowel-consonant words and move to more complex patterns, such as adding a silent or magic E for long vowel sounds. For example, a student who knows the magic E rule sees the word cake and blends the sounds k, a, k together to produce the word. We call this decoding because the reader converted the writing code C-A-K-E to speech sounds. The inverse of decoding is encoding. During encoding, the writer converts the sounds k, a, k to letters. Here, the writer needs knowledge of the code to encode. For the word cake, knowledge of when to use C's and K's and magic E reflect the code-based knowledge needed for encoding. A teacher will integrate decoding and encoding elements during early reading instruction by having students read passages that contain taught phonics patterns, known as decodable texts, and have students spell words that reflect those taught phonics patterns. Further, the principle of cumulative instruction means that skills are revisited and reviewed regularly to build accuracy and automaticity. Therefore, the reading and spelling activities will also include previously taught patterns and words. Which brings us back to those phonetically irregular words from the kindergarten list. What is a teacher supposed to do with these words? Luckily, decoding and encoding can still be used to aid in learning these rule-breaking words. A strategic method developed by Really Great Reading is called heart word magic. Using this method, teachers emphasize spelling to sound relationships. Teachers point out the phonetically regular parts of the word and directly teach the irregular parts, the parts that need to be learned by heart, through direct teaching of the unique spelling. This method facilitates orthographic mapping by drawing readers' attention to the spelling-sound relationships.
So frequently when I talk with teachers and they're asking about what it is they should be doing in their classes, they're like, well, what spelling program do you recommend? And one easy way around that sort of notion is to think about your reading instruction is your spelling program. And so as you are systematically moving through these different phonics patterns, your spelling words reflect those patterns that you're teaching. And not only that, but your spelling list, let's just say you're having a traditional, and we've got a spelling list that we're doing each week, is going to then cycle back in all of the patterns that you've taught from since you started teaching. And so, so if you're working on, in the example in the video, the CK pattern, well, you will have already taught CH, the CH pattern, and you will have already taught, some other patterns. And so you'll have words in there. You also will have a handful of irregular words or that they've taught, or high frequency irregular words. And so those are going to be included in your list as well. But really, in addition to this traditional sort of notion of, oh, I've got my spelling list and I've got my my weekly test, spelling really should be just your daily part of what it is that you're doing, particularly through dictation work. And so we need to, to spell, you need to break those words into those sounds, which is, that phonemic awareness. So you're building phonemic awareness while working on these spelling activities. You're moving from that speech to print. But then they're also, when you're reading, you're translating your spelling into sounds. That's when you're decoding and you're sounding out words. And so when we're also going to have students write during this. So we're going to say a sound, B, and we're going to have the students spell the sound, and they're going to write that. So they're spelling a sound there. When we get to words, we're going to say the word, whether the word is, let's just go with, we have bad, I'll just say, they're going to hear that, and then they're going to spell that. They're going to see that, and then they're going to read it. And so if you think about spelling is happening when you're just doing sound symbol correspondence, grapheme phoneme correspondence, or when you're doing word reading, and then you're going to move into sentences where you can then start building in some of this basic sentence activities, such as capitalization and punctuation at the end, and you're integrating that into the spelling. As you're building this in, you're integrating those high frequency words in there, those irregular ones, the spelling patterns that you've already taught. And so you really and truly are constantly doing decoding, encoding, decoding, encoding to complement the development of those skills and the understanding of that reciprocal relationship. So when we talk about this notion of regular and irregular words, you can, some programs will talk about, all patterns are irregular until they're taught. And once they're taught, they're no longer irregular. It's just, a spelling variation. But there are some words that are particularly tricky or that have unusual spelling patterns, like coyote. And so you do want to, teach that explicitly. I love this heartword method because it goes right back into, we're teaching you to decode a word. So you're using that same exact strategy. You're just saying that this is an unusual spelling pattern. And so we're going to have to memorize this by heart. And if you go to Really Great Reading has some free scripts that you can download, and the University of Florida, their UFly, I'll send you that link. They have slides for all of these irregular words, and they have some really great free materials that are available to support that. So I will, I'll send those links. So those are included with what you get with this webinar. I feel like, and I'll throw in a set of knives, steak knives. But no, I will add that so that you'll have access to that information about irregular words. And then the only part I would say about irregular words is begin to introduce them after they're very comfortable with regular words. So you've taught them, here's a sound, here's the way it's represented in print, here's the letters that represent it. They're comfortable with decoding, and then you say, now here's a funny pattern. Let's go ahead and learn this one by heart, because again, we want to step away from that. I've got to memorize all words. You want them to feel a little bit comfortable with that puzzle first before you start doing that. Obviously, to access any kind of decodable text, they're going to need to know the word the, they're going to need to know the word was, they're going to need to know that. So it does happen fairly quickly, but I'm just saying, wait a couple of weeks of instruction in kindergarten before you start then saying, okay, now let's go ahead and look at this unusual spelling pattern. All right, and then that notion of cumulative review, you're just going to keep wrapping it in, you're going to keep wrapping it in and wrapping it in, and so that they get very comfortable and they remember. And then when we start getting into all these spelling variations, they can become much more fluent and comfortable with there are multiple ways to represent this sound. Which spelling pattern am I going to choose?
We now know that effective reading instruction will include direct teaching of decoding and spelling, including phonetically regular and irregular words. But as we know from the simple view of reading, there is much more to reading than word recognition. Students need to know what the words and sentences mean. As difficulty with language is one risk factor for dyslexia and limited early exposure to a language-rich environment can enhance risk, directly teaching students vocabulary can aid in the development of skilled reading. However, words in isolation do not always build conceptual understanding, which is why engagement with a variety of texts is also essential for developing students' understanding of language, building background knowledge, and knowledge of language structure such as syntax. Like decoding and spelling instruction, a structured approach to language development is systematic and sequential. Rather than haphazardly addressing word meanings as unknown words appear within text, high-utility vocabulary words will be identified, directly taught, and regularly revisited. Likewise, direct attention to morphology will also be included. Beginning in kindergarten, students can learn how word meanings change with the addition of a prefix like un or a suffix like es. Just as decodable texts are an important aspect of decoding and spelling instruction, more complex texts are needed to promote student understanding of language structure. Therefore, classroom instruction and libraries will also include language-rich books, books that delight the ear, mind, and eye. We now know that.
All right, so this is so important. I think that it took a long time for us to wrap our head around the notion that we're not going to do harm by teaching them the code, and that there's some fairly basic ways to begin to systematically give students access to the code. But that's not all there is to reading. And so for students to be able to understand what they're reading, and also for them sometimes to decode a word, they're going to need knowledge. And there are lots of words that you don't know, is this word R-E-D, read or read? And you're going to need some context. And you're going to also need different words in terms of where the accent is on the word is going to change the way we pronounce it. And so we're going to have to bring meaning to those words to figure out what those words are. So what we know is critical for comprehension and understanding what it is that we are reading when we're reading is that we need background knowledge. And so for a long time, there were kind of two primary ways we were getting at this in the classroom. And one was through just vocabulary instruction. We've got a set of vocabulary words. And, so painful for me, it's like, we introduce this word on Monday, you put it in a sentence on Tuesday, on Wednesday, you write a picture book about it. And then, the Thursday make a model out of it. And then Friday we, have a test on it. And we did this, a lot of vocabulary instruction in isolation. The other thing we tried to do is you try to do like all these cognitive strategies for comprehension. So find the main idea, and you'd read like 6 different passages that weren't connected to try to help them learn this isolated skill. But what we really know is that in order to figure out what the main idea of something is you have to understand what it is you're reading. And so to understand what it is you're reading, you have to have some background knowledge in what this is. And so what we need to do is we need to get kids involved in wide reading. And what I mean by that is they need to be reading about stuff. They need to be learning about stuff, and so there's these 3 books in my picture here. And one is, Commotion on the Ocean, and learning about ocean animals and the animals that live in the ocean. So if we're going to start talking about, things that happen in the ocean, they've got to have some background knowledge. I remember when I taught middle school, my students did not believe me that there was such an animal as an octopus. And I was so perplexed, and I was like, what do you mean? I thought they were pulling my leg, but they really thought that this was just sort of like some science fiction thing, that there weren't real animals. So there, you've got to, if students begin to understand things about the ocean, things about ocean life, they've got to sort of have that vocabulary, that understanding. There's another picture of the moon, learning about space. There's another one about spiders, and you can talk about arachnids, and you start talking about animals and kingdoms. So there's so much stuff for kids to learn, and that is what allows them to comprehend and make inferences when they're reading, which is what's required to really understand what a passage is about. Vocabulary instruction can be a part of that, but it should be integrated within that wide reading. And so instead of, 4 different random passages on different topics, we're trying to find the main idea. Let's have a thematic package where we're talking about and we're getting in depth and we're adding on to a knowledge about ocean creatures, spiders, the moon, the solar system, whatever it is. And then we can start adding vocabulary in that context within, then when you can have them practice writing those, you can include some of those within their dictation. You can write those complex words on the board. And when they're doing it in writing their sentences, simple sentence in dictation, that vocabulary word is a reference, and they're writing it, and they're beginning to really understand those words. And then the other part that goes along with comprehension knowledge is really this morphology. And these are these word parts. And so we start talking about, and we can start as early as kindergarten and first grade, talking about, what happens when we put an S at the end of the word. It means there's more of them, there's plural. And we can start talking about word parts and having students be these word detectives to kind of figure out these different word parts. All of that is then going to help them bring meaning to words and understanding the words that they're reading. All right, so structured literacy is not phonics only. Structured literacy means that, we're doing things in a systematic way, we're being explicit about it, that it's cumulative, and it's going to include all of these components that we know contributes to literacy, which is going to be your phonology, it's going to be your semantics, which is your meaning and aids in your word recognition, but also helps you understand what it is that you're reading. So all of those parts are part of this comprehensive, structured approach to literacy, as is writing.
Larger literacy puzzle is writing. Writing and comprehension share a similarly reciprocal relationship as reading and spelling. Work in one area improves the other. Again, we can find differences between structured approaches to writing and writing instruction that relies heavily on students figuring out what sounds right. A common, less structured approach to writing is the writing workshop model. In this model, the teacher will spend time at the beginning of class explaining a concept, such as how to write a story based upon a small event, followed by an extended period of independent writing time. During independent writing time, teachers may conference one-to-one with students about their writing, but the focus of the approach is to provide students with extended periods of independent writing time. In contrast, a structured approach to writing will provide direct teaching of the skills associated with writing development. The skills related to writing include handwriting, spelling, and mechanics, as well as the skills needed to generate and organize ideas, plan, and revise writing. Within a structured approach to writing, explicit instruction in basic writing skills is provided. Researchers have found that gains in spelling and handwriting can lead to improvements in writing quantity and quality. Finally, when teachers connect writing across content areas and writing genres, comprehension and background knowledge are strengthened. Reading is a complex task consisting of overlapping and interdependent skills. Effective reading instruction capitalizes on these relationships while explicitly, systematically, and cumulatively teaching the sub-skills associated with the larger domains of skilled reading. If the majority of students appear to benefit from a structured approach to reading, what does this mean for students with dyslexia? As we reviewed in the video on reading development, the skills required for reading are the same for all students. But some students will pick up on the skills quickly. Many will benefit from systematic, scaffolded attention to the domains of reading, and some, including students with dyslexia, will require more intensive, individualized instruction that is delivered through small group or one-on-one instruction. There are specific features of reading instruction that have been demonstrated as effective for students with dyslexia. Specifically, effective instruction for students with dyslexia is diagnostic and prescriptive. It includes frequent progress monitoring. Students require more time to learn skills and more repetitions of practice to gain proficiency, along with more scaffolds to aid skill acquisition, such as mnemonics to remember spelling rules, physical prompts such as biting an apple to make the short ah sound, or strategies to aid self-regulation. Therefore, the road to reading for students with dyslexia may be a little more winding than it is for some students, but given the appropriate intensity and support, gains in reading, spelling, and writing achievement can be made. Larger literacy.
All right. So many of you sometimes think about, or not many of you personally, I don't know, but sometimes we'll have like this notion that reading instruction and writing instruction are separate, just like reading instruction and spelling instruction are separate. And we think about this writing, many of us grew up, I was trained in the 1990s, and that was the absolute heyday of Writer's Workshop. And so I was doing lots of explicit phonics instruction. I was using Big D, Big I back in the 90s to teach it, and I thought I was doing great. And then I was doing workshopping in my writing. And there's a huge disconnect there because within a workshop model, you're leaving a lot of free time. So it is not explicit, it's not structured, and it's not cumulative. And most importantly, you're not actually even teaching how to teach writing. You're kind of hoping that by having these opportunities for creative writing development, that skills are going to grow, but without any direct teaching in that, you're not going to see that. Students might build some endurance. You might start getting longer passages out of students, but certainly my students who were students with identified learning disabilities, we're riddled with kind of your spelling errors and grammar issues and punctuation issues. And they really weren't getting better at communicating and writing solid sentences that were complete sentences that conveyed an idea. And so writing instruction too needs to be explicit and systematic. And it's a great opportunity for we can think about writing on this sort of continuum where we have elements of writing within your reading lesson where you're learning about the relationship with sounds and letters. And so they're doing some letter formation kinds of activities before you do your dictation. Some teachers have students, write the alphabet at the top of the page, and then they do some dictation work. So they're constantly reinforcing and supporting some handwriting there. You're saying, for dictation, it's short and sweet. And so this is a nice time for you to work on that handwriting. But then when we get into text generation, then students just starting small at the sentence level. What can be very overwhelming is you can think about your typical workshop model. You give the kid 20 minutes if you're lucky, but oftentimes that's a longer block of like 40 minutes of free write, right? And if they write a lot, then it's just riddled with errors and they don't know where to begin, and they can get overwhelmed with that. Versus you write a sentence, you can give immediate feedback, they can make some changes, and they can have more immediate experience with success. And it's a much more effective and efficient way to build those writing skills and to directly teach them. And then finally, we need to continually say the purpose of writing is to communicate. And so how we organize our writing is going to increase that communication, is going to increase the clarity of that communication. And so we can begin to teach kids these self-regulation about how to pay attention to their writing, to check their writing. And then the more often that we can have students writing about the content that they're learning, it's just you're adding that whole comprehension piece and you're building that background knowledge. Okay. So anyway, I've gone over these limitations of a workshop approach. And so, so many of these things, they started with the small, and any of you guys have used units for studies, you'd be very familiar with some of these topics of like, write about a small event. Well, the kids don't know what a small event is, and you give an example of a small event, and then you get 30 essays on that example that you just gave, because that's really kind of an abstract concept of what's a small event in my life versus what's a large event in my life. And so we just want to be a little bit more efficient. And also, again, if we do connect that with content, we're really working on building that knowledge while we're also working on building these writing skills. And if we think about these small bites of focused, accurate writing are going to be much more effective than these longer, unfocused kinds of pieces. All right. Anyway, I think someone was asking about how long, but we're going to go to 8:30 tonight. But I think they're saying, when is it going to come up? And it'll be up soon. All right, so more effective and efficient approaches to writing is really, there's just a ton of great materials and curricula out there that are really sentence level and encouraging you to begin thinking about writing at the sentence level and building those strong sentence. Yeah, again, great curricula that are out there where you can kind of look at how do I begin to start teaching my students about sentences. And again, you're asking them to do this more bite-sized writing. It's within this context that then you can start talking about grammar and about syntax. And we start talking about, the subject verb agreement. And we talk about, does that make sense? And it's much easier at the sentence level to start thinking about those concepts rather than, again, here's a worksheet, circle the predicates and circle, underline the subjects and that kind of thing. Again, using their own writing and then using that in context at the sentence level is a much more focused way to begin to build those skills. And then also you can use writing multiple opportunities across the day. There is an article that a former doc student and I wrote that's in Teaching Exceptional Children, where we gave just some very basic examples of how you could do this, starting with a little bit of writing instruction in the morning where you're going to, talk about a particular writing skill, a writing concept, like what's the difference between a sentence and a fragment. But then as we, do a warm up for our social studies lesson, it's going to be, okay, now write one sentence for your warm up that's related to, this topic that we've been talking about. Maybe you've got an exit ticket at the end of the day. So there's multiple times throughout the day that you can have kids writing. You don't need this 45-minute writing block. And what you'll find is that, the more you give students something to write about, then that also helps facilitate their writing. All right. And then, there we go. And then, some of the things that that come up when we talk about structured literacy is, what are the different components of it? And so if any of you kind of made it through that reading first era, reading first came about right after the National Reading Panel came out with their recommendations. And those were good recommendations, but those recommendations got a little bit misinterpreted along the way. And the way that they presented them resulted in a little bit of confusion. And one part of confusion that came about as a result was sort of that there's, we talk about the big five or the 5 pillars of literacy. And we began to train teachers and began to talk about reading instruction in terms of what are you doing for your phonemic awareness? What are you doing for your phonics? What are you doing for your fluency? What are you doing? And teachers began to think of these as like 5 different separate activities that occurred throughout the day, rather than these were subgroups of the panel that were focusing on specific research, and they were talking about this research. And even in the NPR recommendations, they talked about ways to integrate these, but when they got translated out to reading coaches, sometimes in the schools, it became, I'm going to do 5 different activities. And then sometimes those activities are, a lot of times, they weren't even connected. So I did this phonemic awareness activity on things that then were not connected to my phonics lesson. And I taught just a handful of phonics. And then for fluency, I might be doing repeated reading with pattern books or with leveled books. And that wasn't related to like a decodable book. And then I think one of the other most confusing things is we separated vocabulary from comprehension, which those obviously go together. And what facilitates comprehension is vocabulary knowledge. So I'm going to talk about these points on my slide really quickly. And so, one of the ways to kind of move beyond this notion of these 5 pillars, and we have these 5 different sets of activities that we do within like a reading block or something. We want to think about it much more integrated and much more holistically. One of the things that the National Reading Panel did recommend is that we use letters during using letters during phonemic awareness is an efficient way to really promote that connection, right? And what we know is that, as students practice sounding things out, their phonemic awareness grows. We can also do phonemic awareness activities with felt pieces and chips and things like that. But we also know that it's really efficient when we map those to letters and we're using letters. If that seems to be kind of confusing a student and you need to back up a little bit, you might want to work at a larger level or with felt pieces or cubes or something like that. But really and truly, we know that really effective, efficient phonemic awareness instruction happens with letters. So phonemic awareness and phonics, they go together. Those aren't necessarily separate. My fine print with that is you don't need 20 minutes of PA in a literacy block. Next, phonics instruction should be directly related to that connected text. Therefore, fluency instruction is really a part of that phonics instruction. So as we are getting more fluent with reading those words that we know those phonics patterns, I know sometimes, as a former special education teacher and as a reading tutor, students, once they start decoding, they sometimes have a hard time not decoding even every word. And so you want to do these kind of time drills or fluency box where you're really making them speed up because they've got the skills and they can read it more quickly. We just need to get them to do that. And then we also can be doing that with our decodable books, having them read that, reread those, then they can start adding some expression to those, some chunking, some of that pacing of how to read the sentence in a way that would sound like a fluent, skilled reader. So again, these are not necessarily separate. These are integrated into them. They are integrated. They're just important parts of it. So we just don't want to do phonics. We want to make sure that we are having students get to be fluent and automatic. And we're going to start talking about how we maybe scoop sentences. So for that chunking, adding inflection, changing your voice when a question goes up, and do that. So the fine print is that you want students reading and rereading and practicing their prosody while reading materials that are accessible or primarily decodable for them. And then finally, comprehension is aided by knowledge. So vocabulary building is only one component of knowledge building. The fine print with that is that vocabulary needs to be connected to wide reading, get those good, interesting, fun books in that classroom, make sure they're getting exposure to them. You can even help scaffold some of that reading, particularly as we're getting past that kindergarten, first grade, we're getting into that mid-second grade. We certainly want to start moving them into more complex tasks, scaffolding that for them, but making sure that they're getting some of that practice, getting into those complex puzzle pieces and out of the baby puzzle pieces. Great. And then also hand in hand with comprehension is going to be your writing instruction. And so what you're doing with that writing, and when you're doing writing, that is all aiding their ability to read and understand, whether it's narrative or it's informative text. All of that is going to be important, facilitated by knowing things and having knowledge.
Let's review. What are the 3 features of a structured approach to literacy? Structured literacy is explicit, systematic, and cumulative. Does memorization of sight words facilitate reading development? No. Researchers have found that sight word acquisition is supported by decoding and spelling, not by memorizing whole words. What should early reading instruction look like? Early reading instruction should focus on teaching phonics, moving from simple to more complex. What is the role of decodable text in reading instruction? As students learn new phonics skills, decodable texts provide an opportunity for them to practice their skills. What is the relationship between decoding and spelling? Like many reading-related skills, decoding and spelling share a reciprocal relation. When teachers pair decoding instruction with spelling instruction, both skills are strengthened. Does a structured approach to literacy only involve the teaching of phonics? No. Reading does not occur in isolation of meaning. Within structured approaches to reading, teachers will directly teach vocabulary and morphology and engage students with complex texts. What are the components of effective writing instruction? Lack of fluency in foundational skills such as handwriting and spelling can limit writing output and expression. Therefore, effective writing instruction will specifically address these skills. In addition, direct teaching of text generation and self-regulation techniques have been shown to enhance writing quality. Do students with dyslexia require instruction that is different? Yes. Effective instruction for students with dyslexia will be diagnostic and prescriptive, include frequent progress monitoring, have sufficient levels of intensity, and reflect strategic scaffolding. Funding for the dyslexia, let's review.
All right. So I'm going to wrap up very quickly. Jennifer has got some great content information. So I'm going to move through these next few slides a little bit more quickly, but do know that the PowerPoint will be available to you after this is all over. So structured literacy is an approach to teaching reading and writing that's comprehensive. It is not phonics only. Phonics instruction should be much more than find the pictures that begin with the letter C, but it's really going to be that systematic exposure and practice and engagement with the code over time that is connected, that involves reading connected text on a daily basis. When we get to our phonics myths, some of the pushback that you get when you start talking about phonics is, but all kids learn differently, which is true. All kids are different, but the structure of English is not. And so the teaching implication is that some kids are going to need more examples and practice, but the content of what's going to be taught doesn't change. You need to teach the code. If we're going to go back to the Hottentot example, is we're going to need to know the sounds of the language, and we're going to need to know the spelling patterns that map to those. And so that is going to be the same. So fundamentally, all students, are going to benefit from this. It's just going to be these differences, and maybe some kids are going to need more examples, and they're going to need more practice opportunities for doing it. Another myth is that English is just too irregular to be taught. And really and truly, when you start looking at words, that they're not that irregular. And so even the heart word method is why I like it so much, because it's like, we can use decoding. It's just an unusual spelling pattern that we're looking at. And so we just need to figure out what that pattern is. But really, the vast majority of words can be read by applying a regular sound symbol correspondence. That 50% of them are just regular. And if you have, another 34%, if you just it only has one irregularity. So again, it's just figuring out, so the most that word can be, if you know what that one irregularity is, then you can read that. There is a concept that I don't know if I've talked about in other videos and other webinars, this notion of set for variability. And set for variability is just simply a pronunciation correction. So in my household, our favorite mispronunciation is a friend of ours, her son, who's in middle school, was reading, and he said, I'm feeling a little melancholy. And the mom said, what? She's like, yeah, I'm just a little melancholy. And then she looked, and the word was melancholy. And so we always say now you can say it too if you're feeling a little melancholy. So we all do that. So we're reading a word, no one's correcting it. But what happens with set for variability is you're reading a word, and you might encounter melancholy for the first time, and you'll say melancholy, and you're like, that doesn't sound like a word I've heard, but you've heard and you know the word melancholy. That's what set for variability is, that you just are doing a mispronunciation correction because you're like, was. That's not was is a word that I know. And so it is simply, I've misdecoded it. I've incorrectly decoded it, but I can do a self-correction because I have that word in my oral language vocabulary. So the teaching implication with that myth is that teaching letter sound correspondence is critical and really facilitates students' understanding of the code. And then as students get more proficient with the code, they are going to get into that notion of self-teaching, where they're applying their knowledge of the code to novel words that they see. They're using their set for variability to maybe figure out patterns that they haven't even been taught before. And then finally, the one that is just horrible for me is phonics is boring. There's nothing more exciting than learning the code. Kids love to figure things out. It's just, how do we make this mystery exciting and engaging for them and rewarding? And part of that is, if we know what we're talking about as teachers, we can slowly kind of build this, this is the sound, this is this letter pattern, and here's how we are doing it. And once students start to have success with it, instruction is really fun. So when we're teaching, the key to effective any instruction, whether that's going to be our soccer or our basketball or reading, is we're going to break it down, we're going to practice it, we're going to apply it, and then we're going to generalize it, and we're going to be able to apply this in novel situations. So Pamela Snow has this amazing balanced literacy bingo. And so again, some of these myths, come from that or related to that. She has so many more in there, but there are things that you will commonly hear when you get pushed back to, I really want to be doing structured literacy, or we really need some phonics instruction. She addresses those myths. So that link is on here, which is great. And now I will turn it over to Jennifer.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for that fabulous presentation, Kristen. And there's just so much wonderful information to digest. And I love reading all the comments in the chat that you can't wait to get back to school to start applying this. And again, just as a reminder for those of you, if this is your first one, you pick the best one to start with. But we do encourage you to go back and watch the other recordings of the first 3 webinars and share them far and wide with colleagues, administrators, coaches, parents, anyone. I think it's relevant to most people. So what I'm going to do, if you can go back one screen, Kristen. Okay, so the remainder of the presentation this evening, what my intent is to, receive a lot of questions from teachers, from parents, from interventionists saying, well, what do I do if my school or my district, we know how to teach reading, we know what the science says, we know what the research supports, but we're still not doing it, or we're still blending a little bit of this and a little bit of that. So where do we go from here as we're looking forward to 2024? And I know we want that to be here now. So we have developed some guiding questions for administrators and teachers, and this is actually going to be part of a future webinar series that we're hosting starting. The first one is on January 26th, where we have panelists from our 7 dyslexia pilot districts talking about their experiences, their journeys in the implementation of SB 48. And what we're asking participants to do who are registered for that event is to then go take these discussion questions or this guide that we've created back and talk with colleagues and try to answer some of these questions on where do we go from here? What's our roadmap look like? So that's the kind of backstory or the rationale for the questions. And this is just a very small sampling of the questions. And I do see, how do we find that event? I will add that to the resources that you'll be getting when you receive a link to the recording. I'll make sure you have that, but I've shared that with lots of different groups and individuals. So we'll be sure to share that link to register for that. And then the second part of that webinar series is coming back, and it's more open Q&A with the panelists. And especially after you've had a chance to go talk with colleagues at your district and building level, and have more targeted questions after hearing from the panelists in session 1. And that second session is in March. But again, I'll post the link to that. Okay, thanks, Kristen. Now we can move forward. Okay, great. So I think you just saw the link to where to register for those events. So for core instruction, some of the questions that you want to be asking, and again, if you're a teacher in a district, if you're a parent, to really look at what we've learned over the last 2.5 going on 3 years now with the pilot districts, and for those other districts who are choosing to start implementing SB 48 or planning for it, is that they really need to look at what their core instruction look like. So that's the first question. That's where you want to start. What K-3 literacy curricular and instructional materials does your school and district currently use? One of the main takeaways we also have learned is that we keep, a lot of districts keep adding, but they're not removing. So we're putting more in the closet when we should, one in, one out might be an approach that you want to think about, but you don't want to have curricula that you're using that are that are misaligned or in conflict with one another. So you don't want to, combine a balanced literacy approach with an approach that is based on an evidence-based reading instruction, because that's very confusing for teachers and for students. So what are you currently using? What should we reconsider or reevaluate? Then, of course, the next logical question would be, to what extent are these curricula materials aligned with evidence-based reading? And how did you make that determination? And we provided some links and evaluation tools and rubrics for you that I'm going to share also in just a minute, but that will be part of that discussion guide. Okay, go ahead. Again, keep thinking still about core instruction. So if less than or fewer than 80% of your students are meeting grade level standards for reading and writing, how's your district examine the student data? So what are you doing with the data you're collecting? What decisions is it systematically being reviewed to identify gaps that need to be addressed on a school-wide or district-wide basis? And some of these are hard questions that you, need to be prepared to answer as a team. Also, if fewer than 80% of students are meeting grade level standards, what plans are in place to strengthen the core literacy? And again, to reevaluate what curricula are being used and teacher training in that area. Okay, so then moving on, we're approaching the professional development and evaluation of what's happening from an instructional standpoint and progress monitoring the same way as we're going through the tiers. So let's start with core, and now moving on to tier 2, tier 3 special education, which would be considered the targeted intensive intervention. What do those look like? What intervention programs or strategies are being used? How do these align with what's happening in tier 1 at the core instruction, making sure it's building upon, not vastly different. So, it's more intensive, it is more targeted. So it shouldn't be exactly the same, but just more of it. But it should build on the foundation of what's in the instruction that's being implemented in tier 1. Some other questions thinking about the more targeted intervention. What intervention programs or strategies do you plan to use that be appropriate for students with characteristics of dyslexia? And how is this different from students with other types of learning challenges or more broad reading difficulties that may have more of a issue or difficulty with comprehension? So tier 2 reading instruction should not look the same for all students. So we really want to use the data to pinpoint the specific deficits and weaknesses and provide that targeted intervention accordingly, and not just a one-size-fits-all at tier 2 reading, a one-size-fits-all at tier 3 reading. So really dive into and evaluate where those deficits or weaknesses lie. And then again, looking back at the previous question, how are these interventions similar to and different from the ones? So it's not just more of it. What do we, how is that looking a bit differently, and what is the training for those teachers looking like? Okay. And then again, which areas? So it could be that, you have a small group of students that don't need intensive intervention in all 5 of these areas. So you again have to break that down and determine what their needs are, and then provide an intervention accordingly. And this is, I included this as a resource on this next slide in the second webinar, video 2. But these are 2 really good resources. You can go to the next slide, Kristen. The Reading League, they have curriculum evaluation guidelines and a rubric that you can use as you're selecting or looking at evaluating your current curricula. or looking to adopt a new program, and looking also aligning that with your teacher training. And then EdReports also has report that you can filter and then identify ELA. Is it just foundations of reading? What the specific areas of reading? And then they have they've rated based on the criteria that you can look at the programs that are aligned with evidence-based reading instruction. And this is also another resource and questions that I shared with video too, but it's also very relevant to this final video. In webinars, how can I find out? These are lots of questions I receive, and many of you may receive from parents, or you have these questions yourself. If you are a parent, how do I find out how my child's school teaches reading? What if my child's school is not teaching reading in ways backed by science? I want to do activities at home. What do I do? I think my kid is struggling with reading. How do I know? And what do I do? Who do I contact? And on the next slide is a link to, this is the EdReport that has those questions and answers to it. And here's the link to that as well. And that is it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lindstrom and Dr. Sayeski for presenting tonight. That was a lot of information, and it was fabulous. So we did have a lot of questions come in tonight. Most of them I felt were answered during the presentation, which is great. There is one quick question, if y'all have a minute, that came in, and the question was, what is the expectation for districts starting in 2024?
And Nicole, I saw that you included SB 48, and on page 5 of that, you can see what the expectations are. And it's the focus, I encourage you to read through it, but the expectations are screening K-3 students for characteristics of dyslexia, continuing progress monitoring. There's not specific language in the bill about what type of intervention needs to be provided. There is emphasis on providing professional development for teachers in screening, progress monitoring, and intervention. But again, it doesn't specify what that needs to look like. And then annually, districts need to report the number of students identified with characteristics of dyslexia, the number of new students. So what we have over the next 9 to 12 months is a lot of effort and work from our dyslexia task force, which some of you on this webinar right now may be actually a member of that task force. And if you are, thank you so much. But we have one of our working groups. There's about 60 members of the task force, and one of the working groups is statewide professional learning, that they are creating a strategic plan of what that's going to look like and the different topics. So we'll be rolling that out over the next 1 to 3 to 5 years. So these are all the topics that we're going to be addressing in terms of what does it look like for districts. And I know a lot of you are eager to know now, which I understand. I want to know a lot of these answers right now too. But we're making progress. I'm happy to report, but there's still a tremendous amount of work that needs to be done. I did see a question about the list of screeners. We can't say goodbye without addressing that. The last I was informed is that it's the list of possible screeners from vendors who submitted applications to be included on that list of an approved screener will be voted on at the February or March board meeting. And that's what I have been told.
Thank you. And thank you again, Dr. Lindstrom and Dr. Sayeski, for tonight's presentation and discussion. I just want to let everyone know to please be on the lookout for an email. It will come from IDA Georgia, and it will contain a link to the recording for tonight. And there will also be a link to a survey if anyone is interested in a certificate of attendance. And I just want to thank everyone in attendance tonight. We had a good showing, and I want to encourage everyone to register for the 2023 Wednesday webinar series coming up called Spotlight on Structured Literacy. This is sponsored by the IDA Georgia along with the Reading League Georgia. The first webinar is going to be on Wednesday, January 18th at 7 p.m. And the title for the webinar is "The Magic is in the Instruction. The Science of Reading Joins the Science of Instruction." And Dr. Anita Archer will be our guest presenter. So please watch for a link to register for that. And thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your evening. Good night.
All right, thanks, everyone.